clean more rooms after death than most funeral directors will in their entire careers. And I want to start there, with that fact, because I need you to understand that I am not a man who is easily shaken by what a dying body leaves behind. I have seen things in 11 years at Ashford Continuing Care that would end most people's careers in their first month. None of it ever touched me the way this did. I'm not going to tell you my real name, and I'm not going to tell you the facility's real name either. Though if you've lived in this region, you may already have a guess, because there really aren't that many standalone long-term care facilities built the way this one was, with the original wing dating back further than anyone on staff seemed to actually know. I want to explain my job before I explain what happened, because the job is the reason I was the one who saw it, and almost nobody understands what an orderly actually does. People think it's lifting. It is lifting, some of it, moving patients who can't move themselves, turning bodies to prevent bed sores, transporting people to imaging or therapy, or, eventually, transporting them somewhere else entirely. But the part of the job nobody talks about, the part that ends up belonging to whoever's working the night shift, is the cleanup after a death. Not the medical part. Nurses and doctors handle that. The pronouncement, the paperwork, the call to the family. The physical part. Stripping the bed, bagging the linens, wiping down every surface a body or its fluids touched, resetting the room so that by morning, when housekeeping does the official terminal clean, there's no trace left of what happened in there overnight. That job falls to orderlies, and on the night shift, it usually falls to one orderly, alone, because facilities like Ashford run skeleton crews after midnight, and somebody has to be ready the moment a room needs to be turned over for the next admission. I want to be clear that I never minded this work. I think there's something almost sacred about being the last person to touch a space before it becomes ready for someone new. The person who makes sure the next patient who lies in that bed never has to know what happened there before them. I took it seriously. I still believe, even after everything, that it's necessary work, and that somebody has to do it, and that I did it well for a very long time before it started doing something back to me. The original building, what we called the East Wing, dates back to the 1960s, originally constructed as a private sanatorium before being converted into long-term care in the 80s. The newer wings, North and South, were added in the 2000s. All clean lines and modern fixtures, easy to clean, easy to forget. The East Wing is different. Higher ceilings, narrower halls, an old radiator heating system that groans audibly all winter. Room numbers in a font nobody's used since the building went up, still stenciled directly onto the doors instead of on removable plaques like the newer wings. I worked mostly East Wing nights because I'd been there longest and the newer staff didn't like it, which I understood as nothing more than them being spooked by old architecture and bad lighting. I want you to remember that I thought that. I want you to remember how confident I was that it was nothing more than that. There's a rhythm to night shift at a place like Ashford that's different from a hospital, because the population doesn't change the way a hospital's does. Hospital patients come and go in days. Ashford residents stay for months, years sometimes, and you get to know them in a way that a hospital orderly never gets to know the people he's moving between rooms. You learn who likes the television on low all night and who can't sleep with any sound at all. You learn whose family visits every Sunday without fail and whose family hasn't called in 8 months. By my 4th year, I knew the East Wing residents better than I knew most of my own relatives, which sounds sad when I say it out loud, but didn't feel that way at the time. It felt like purpose. It felt like the one part of the job that made the rest of it bearable, the cleanup, the loss, the quiet 2 a.m. phone calls telling me a room needed to be turned over. I should say something about the cleanup procedure itself, because the specifics matter to what happened later. After a nurse pronounces a death, and the family has had whatever time they need with the body, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, we never rush that part no matter how it affected my schedule. The body is removed by the contracted funeral service, and only then does my part begin. I strip the linens and bag them for the incinerator. Never the regular laundry. That's protocol everywhere I've worked. I wipe every surface with hospital-grade disinfectant, working corner to corner, leaving nothing untouched. Bed rails, nightstand, call button, the arms of any chair a visitor might have used, the windowsill, the door handle on both sides. Then I remake the bed with fresh linens, hospital corners, the way I was trained on my very first week, and I leave the room dark and ready, because by morning a new resident's family might be touring it, and Ashford's policy, like most facilities, was never to let a room sit visibly empty and unprepared for longer than necessary. There's an unspoken efficiency to death in a place like this. The bed needs a new occupant. The waiting list is long. I understood that as simply the way the business worked, and for years, that understanding was enough to let me do the job without it weighing on me the way I think it would have if I'd let myself dwell on the math of it. Someone dies, and within hours, sometimes, the room is ready for someone else to begin the same process all over again. I tell you all of this not because it's pleasant, but because I need you to understand exactly how mechanical, how routine, how unhaunted this job felt to me for the first 4 years. I was good at it. I took pride in being good at it. Nothing about stripping a bed or wiping a nightstand should have ever felt like anything other than what it was. The first time something happened, I'd been at Ashford about 4 years. A woman in room 114, East Wing, passed in her sleep. Peaceful, expected. She'd been declining for months, and the family had already said their goodbyes the week before. I got the call around 2 a.m., did the standard wait for the nurse to complete her part, and then went in to do mine. Stripped the bed, bagged the linens, wiped the rails, the nightstand, the call button, the chair where a daughter had been sitting just hours earlier. Standard procedure, maybe 40 minutes start to finish. I shut the light off, closed the door, and moved on to my other rounds. About an hour later, doing a routine hourly check of the East Wing hallway, I noticed light coming from under the door of 114. I distinctly remembered turning that light off. I opened the door, and the room was exactly as I'd left it. Bed stripped, surfaces clean, nothing disturbed, except the overhead light was on, bright, fully on, the kind of on that doesn't happen from a loose switch or a power flicker. I turned it off again. I checked the switch itself, flipped it on and off a few times to make sure it wasn't faulty wiring, which would have been the obvious, boring explanation and the one I genuinely hoped for. The switch worked perfectly. On, off, exactly the way it should. I left, made a mental note to mention it to maintenance the next morning, which I did, and they found nothing wrong with it either. I want to tell you that this didn't bother me much at the time, and that's true. I'd worked in old buildings before. Old buildings do strange things. Drafts, settling, electrical quirks that take years to track down. I filed it under old building and didn't think about it again for almost 6 months. The second time, it wasn't a light. It was room 108, 2 doors down from 114, after an elderly man passed from complications following a stroke. Same procedure. Strip, bag, wipe, reset. I left the room clean and dark around 3 a.m. and continued my rounds. At shift change, around 6:30, the day nurse coming in to do her first walkthrough found the bed unmade, not stripped the way I'd left it, but made, fully made, hospital corners, pillow centered, exactly the way a bed looks before a new patient is admitted into it. Except no one had been in that room between 3 a.m. and 6:30. I know that because I was the only staff member on that hall the entire time, and I never went back in. She assumed I'd made the bed myself and simply forgotten, or that housekeeping had come through earlier than usual. I let her believe that, because the alternative was telling her that an empty room I knew for a fact I'd left stripped down to the bare mattress had somehow, with no one inside it, made itself up again, hospital corners and all, in a way I genuinely could not have replicated even if I'd tried, because making hospital corners that precise takes me a full 2 minutes of focused effort, and there was no 2 minutes in that night where I wasn't somewhere else, doing something else, accounted for by cameras at the nurse's station that I checked the footage of, twice, alone, the next week. The footage showed the hallway outside 108. It showed me leaving at 3:04 a.m. It showed no one entering or leaving that door for the rest of the night. The door simply sits there, closed, for 3 hours and 26 minutes of grainy black and white nothing, and then the day nurse opens it at 6:30, and the bed is made. I started, after that, paying closer attention to the East Wing in a way I hadn't before. Not obsessively. I want to be honest about the pace of this, because if I tell it too compressed, it sounds like I lost my mind in a week, and that's not what happened. This unfolded over years. I'd estimate, looking back, that something I couldn't explain happened in that wing maybe 4 or 5 times a year, which is rare enough that you can talk yourself out of patterns, and frequent enough that eventually you stop being able to. The pattern once I let myself see it, was this. It only happened in rooms where I had been the one to perform the cleanup after a death. Not every time. Maybe one death in 10 produced something afterward. But it never happened in a room I hadn't personally cleaned. And it never happened after a death I hadn't personally attended to. And once I noticed that, I started, almost against my will, keeping track of which rooms I'd cleaned and which ones I hadn't. The same instinct, I'd guess, that made the nurse I once knew start a private notebook of her own. I didn't write anything down. I didn't need to. I remembered every room. You don't forget the rooms. Here's what I came to believe. Slowly, reluctantly, after years of evidence I couldn't keep explaining away. The rooms weren't haunted in the sense of a person lingering, a ghost with unfinished business, the kind of thing you see in movies. What I think happened, what I still think, even now, sitting here telling you this, is that the act of cleaning, of erasing every trace of a death so thoroughly that the next person would never know, didn't actually erase anything. It just moved it somewhere I couldn't see. The room remembered what I'd tried to make it forget, and every so often, not predictably, not on any schedule I could ever map, it would show me that the forgetting hadn't worked. The light turning back on was the room saying someone is still here. The bed making itself was the room saying, I am ready for the next one, the way I was ready for the last one, the way I will always be ready, because nothing that happens in me actually ends. In my 7th year, a younger orderly named Marcus started on the night shift, and because I was the most senior orderly on East Wing, training him fell to me. I didn't tell him anything about what I'd noticed over the years. I'd long since decided that whatever was happening in that wing was mine to carry, not something to pass on to someone just starting out. The same instinct, maybe, that made Denise from the story I'd later hear secondhand keep her own silence for decades. About 4 months into his training, Marcus came to find me after finishing his first solo cleanup. In room 121, 2 doors down from where Harold would eventually pass. He was pale in a way I recognized immediately, because I'd worn that same look myself years before. He told me he'd left the room dark and locked, the way we always did. And when he walked past, 20 minutes later doing his rounds, he heard, faintly, through the closed door, the unmistakable sound of a television turning on. Not static, not a malfunction, but the specific click and hum of a television powering up, followed by 10 or 15 seconds of an actual broadcast, voices, music, before it cut to silence again. Room 121 had no working television. Maintenance had removed the old set 8 months earlier after it broke, and Ashford hadn't budgeted to replace it. A fact every single staff member on that wing knew, because residents complained about it constantly. I asked Marcus what he did. He said he stood outside the door for almost a full minute, working up the nerve to open it, and when he finally did, the room was exactly as he'd left it. Dark, clean, no television, no possible source of the sound he'd heard. I told him, because it was the only thing I could think to say that was both true and useful, that old buildings make strange sounds, pipes and wiring and settling foundations, and that he shouldn't let it get to him. He nodded like he wanted to believe me. He transferred to North Wing 6 weeks later, request approved without question, no explanation given beyond preferring the newer building's layout, and we never discussed it again, though I noticed, for the rest of the time we worked together, that he never once volunteered to cover an East Wing shift, even when the extra pay would have helped him, even when I was technically the one asking the favor. I think about Marcus sometimes, the way I think about the nurse's story I heard secondhand years after I'd left Ashford myself. A story about empty beds and a name spoken by someone who shouldn't have known it, told by a woman I never met but recognized completely. The way you recognize a stranger's account of your own house from the outside. I don't know if every facility like ours has its version of this. I've started to suspect that anywhere death becomes routine enough to require a cleanup procedure, anywhere a building processes enough endings that the endings start to blur together into something the building itself seems to hold on to, you'll find someone who knows exactly what I'm talking about, and you'll find that they've mostly kept it to themselves, the way Marcus did, the way I did, for years longer than either of us should have. The night that broke something in me happened in my 9th year, in a room I will tell you the number of praise, because by now it doesn't matter who finds out. Room 1119, the last room at the very end of the East Wing Hall, the one with a window facing the old maintenance courtyard nobody uses anymore. A man named Harold had been a resident there for almost 3 years, longer than most, the kind of resident the staff genuinely loved, sharp as anything despite his body failing him, always asked the orderlies how our nights were going, instead of the other way around. He passed on a Thursday, expected his daughter had been there. It was about as peaceful as these things get. I did the cleanup the way I always did. Strip, bag, wipe, reset. I remember taking a little longer than usual in that room, not because anything was wrong, but because I'd liked him, and some part of me wanted to do the job carefully, as a kind of last respect, even though he'd never know. I finished around 1 a.m., turned off the light, closed the door, and went to do my rounds in North Wing, which usually took about 90 minutes. When I came back through East Wing around 2:30, the light under 119's door was on again, same as it had been with 114, all those years before, and by now, I knew exactly what that meant, and exactly how little point there was in fighting it. I opened the door anyway because some stubborn part of me still needed to see it confirmed every single time, still needed the small relief of being wrong even though I never was. The light was on, the room was clean, exactly as I'd left it, and sitting on the freshly wiped nightstand, centered, deliberate, was Harold's reading glasses, the ones I distinctly remembered bagging with the rest of his belongings to send home with his daughter. The ones I had personally zipped into a clear plastic bag and left at the nurse's station for pickup less than 2 hours earlier. I want to tell you I checked the nurse's station immediately, because I did, and the bag was exactly where I'd left it, sealed, untouched, glasses still inside, because of course they were, because I had never actually taken them out, because there was no version of events where those glasses could be in two places at once, except the version where the room had simply decided to put something there that mattered. The way you'd leave a light on for someone who isn't coming back. The way you'd make a bed for someone who already left. I put the glasses back in the bag. I sealed it again with packing tape because the original seal was somehow intact and I hadn't broken it, which meant I needed it to look broken now, needed there to be some physical evidence that something had happened. Even an act of vandalism I'd committed myself, because the alternative was admitting that nothing about this could be explained by anything I was capable of doing. I never told the day staff. The daughter picked up the bag 2 days later. I have no idea if she ever opened it, ever noticed the second seal, ever wondered why her father's glasses smelled faintly, just slightly, of the disinfectant I used to wipe down nightstands. I think about that more than almost anything else from those 11 years. Not the light, not the bed, not even the glasses themselves, but the thought of her opening that bag in her own home, weeks or months later, running her thumb over the packing tape, without knowing it shouldn't have been there. I kept working East Wing for almost 2 more years after that, because by then I'd convinced myself of something that I now recognize as a kind of bargain I made with no one, a deal that existed only in my own head. If I kept doing the job carefully, respectfully, the way I always had, the room, the building, whatever it actually was, would keep its strangeness contained to small things, lights, beds, glasses left where they shouldn't be. Nothing that hurt anyone, nothing that crossed a line I couldn't come back from. I told myself that as long as I kept showing up and kept doing right by the people who died in that wing, whatever lived underneath the building's memory would have no reason to do anything worse. I don't actually know if that bargain was real, or just something I needed to believe to keep walking into that wing every night. But I can tell you that the one time I tested it, the one time I rushed a cleanup, did it sloppily, because I was exhausted and it was 4 a.m. and I just wanted the shift to end, was the only time something happened that I still can't talk about without my hands shaking, and it's also the last story from that building I'm willing to tell anyone. Because some things, once said out loud, don't go back into the bag no matter how much tape you put on it. I left Ashford 18 months ago. I told my supervisor it was for better pay at a hospital closer to home, which is true, and also the smallest possible fraction of the actual reason. I work day shift now. I have never once volunteered for a death cleanup since I left, and on the rare occasions I've been the only one available and had no choice. I do the job fast, efficient, professional, and I do not let myself linger. Do not let myself feel anything close to the careful tenderness I used to bring to that work. Because tenderness, I've come to believe, is exactly what the room was responding to. It wasn't malice that kept reaching back toward me. It was recognition. Of all the staff who passed through that wing over the years, I was the one who treated those rooms like they mattered after the person in them was gone, and I think, in whatever way a building like that can think, it knew, and it never wanted me to stop. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my supervisor on my actual last shift, because I've never told anyone the full version of it before. Her name was Linda, and she'd run East Wing operations for almost 25 years, longer than anyone else on staff, long enough that I'd always assumed she was simply a fixture of the building rather than someone with a life outside it. When I gave my notice, she didn't ask me the usual questions about pay or commute. She looked at me for a long moment and asked, very quietly, whether I'd started noticing things in the rooms I'd cleaned. I didn't answer right away, and she took my silence as the answer it was. She told me that in 25 years, she'd had exactly 4 orderlies leave the way I was leaving. Abruptly, citing reasons that didn't quite add up, never once looking back once they were gone. She said every one of them had worked East Wing nights longer than 2 years, and every one of them had, at some point, stopped being willing to make eye contact with her when discussing the cleanup logs. She asked if I wanted to talk about what I'd seen. I told her no, because I genuinely didn't think I could say any of it out loud without losing the thin remaining thread of certainty that I was still a reliable narrator of my own life. She nodded like she understood completely, which she probably did, and she said one thing before I left her office for the last time. The building doesn't let go of people who were good to it. Consider this, it letting go of you instead, before it decided not to. I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count, and I still don't know if it was meant as comfort or as a warning, or if, for a place like Ashford, there's even a difference between the two. I still don't know if any of this is something to be proud of, or something I should never have let myself become. Some nights, the ones where sleep doesn't come easy, I lie there wondering whether room 119 still turns its light on for no one, whether some new orderly who's never heard a word of this has started noticing things he can't explain and hasn't yet let himself believe it. I hope, if that's true, that he's smart enough to leave faster than I did. I hope he doesn't make my mistake, which wasn't fear. Fear would have gotten me out in the first year. My mistake was caring enough to stay, long after caring stopped being safe. A few months ago, almost by accident, scrolling through something late at night the way you do when you can't sleep, I came across an account from a hospital nurse describing something that stopped me cold. Empty beds that read occupied, a pattern she'd tracked for years. A colleague who warned her that counting was its own kind of danger. I don't know that woman. I will probably never meet her. But reading her account felt like reading a description of my own hands from across a room I'd never been in. And it's part of why I finally decided to tell this story myself, because I think we are not as rare as either of us assumed. And I think the only thing worse than what we both saw is the particular loneliness of believing you're the only one who's ever seen it. If you've ever worked the job nobody wants to talk about, the cleanup, the aftermath, the part of death that happens after the family's gone and the room goes quiet, I think you already know there are buildings that remember more than they should. I think you've felt it too, even if you've never said it out loud. I'm saying it now so you don't have to be the only one who knows.